Next, let us discuss how to construct individual HTTP requests for each of these operations. And before constructing such HTTP requests, let us take a step back and discuss a little about HTTP in general. So here we have our API. You can assume that our API is in the cloud, for example, in AWS. And here we have a browser running in a laptop. The way communication happens between the browser and the API is the browser initiates the communication by making a request. When the API receives the request, it starts processing the request, and when the processing is done, it sends back a response to the browser. And typically, the request is a HTTP request and the response is a HTTP response. HTTP stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. The term protocol means rules. So informally, we can say that HTTP is the language of communication between the browser and the web server. There are multiple parts in a HTTP request: the request URL, the request method, and there are a couple of other things as well. Before discussing the other parts, let's quickly discuss about the different HTTP request methods first. The Wikipedia page for Hypertext Transfer Protocol says that HTTP defines methods to indicate the desired action to be performed on the identified resource. So these HTTP requests can be of different types, and we can use the different request methods to make different HTTP requests. The common HTTP request methods are GET, which is typically used to retrieve data; POST, which is typically used to create a new entry for the web resource that is identified by the URI; PUT for updating a record; DELETE for deleting a record; and PATCH to apply partial modifications to a record. So GET for retrieving records, POST for creating a new record, PUT and PATCH for updating a record, and DELETE for deleting a record. These are the common request methods that we typically use. Now let us look at the message format of a HTTP request message. The request message consists of the following. So at the top we will have a request line. The first word will be the HTTP request method that can be GET, POST, PUT, PATCH, DELETE, etc. So that is the resource operation. Next we will have the resource identifier. That means a path to a resource. For example, here images/logo.png is a resource, and we have specified the path to logo.png over here. And then after that we have to specify the name of the protocol, which is HTTP/1.1 in this example. And below the request line we can have one or more header fields. In the HTTP 1.1 protocol, all header fields except host are optional. So in HTTP 1.1 we have to specify the host header field, and the rest are optional. Another common header field that we pass is content-type. And after we specify one or more header fields, we should have an empty line, and then we can have an optional message body. This is typically used when we want to create a new record or update an existing record. We usually specify a message body for PUT, PATCH, and POST HTTP request methods. Let's examine this one more time. At the top we have a request line. The first word will be the HTTP request method, meaning it can be GET, POST, PUT, PATCH, DELETE, etc. And beside that we have to specify the path to the resource. That means the part of the URL after excluding the host name. And at the end of the request line we should specify the HTTP protocol version, like HTTP/1.1. And below the request line we can have one or more header fields. In HTTP 1.1, host is compulsory, so we'll specify at least the host header field. And another common header field that we usually specify is content-type. And below the header fields we should have an empty line, and below the empty line we can have an optional message body, which we usually use for PUT, PATCH, and POST methods. Now let us construct some HTTP requests by using what we have learned over here. Let's assume that this is our API running in the cloud, and this is our browser running on a laptop. Let's say we have a RESTful API that is based on this JSON data over here. There is a books resource, which is an array that has 2 book records, and each book record is an object that has an ID and an author. Now let us write some HTTP requests to do some resource operations on this data over here. The first operation that we want to do is we want to read all the book records, and whenever we want to read or retrieve records we have to use the GET HTTP request method. So our HTTP request will look like this: get/books HTTP/1.1. This is the request line. that we have seen over here and similar to the example over here. And next we have a header field called host, where we specify localhost colon 4000, assuming that our API is running on localhost colon 4000. And below that we have a second header field called content-type, and we specified the value application/JSON, indicating that we want to communicate in JSON. When this request reaches the API, the request is processed and we get back a HTTP response. Since we specified get and /books, we indicated that we wanted to get all the book records, and so we get back an array which contains all of the book records. To get some real practice, let us write that HTTP request by hand. On the left here, I have placed the same JSON data of the books resource. We'll write a HTTP request over here, and we'll also write the expected HTTP response over here. So to read all the book records, that means to retrieve all the book records, we need to use get. So let's write that, and the path will be /books, and then we have to specify the HTTP version, HTTP/1.1. So this is our request line. Next we have to specify our header fields. I mentioned that for HTTP 1.1, host is a required header field, so I have specified host here, and the host will be localhost colon 4000, and we usually also specify the content-type to indicate the format that we want to deal in, and that is application/JSON. And when this request reaches the API, the request is processed and the response that we get will be this array over here. So I'm going to copy that and I'm going to paste that over here. So this will be our HTTP response for our HTTP request over here. For our second example, let us read one book record. And as I have mentioned previously, to read or retrieve a record, we need to use the getHTTP request method. So our HTTP request will look like this. It will be similar to the previous HTTP request, except that in this path over here, we'll also have the ID of the book that we want to retrieve. The rest of the HTTP request is the same. And when this HTTP request reaches the API, the request is processed and we get back a HTTP response. And that HTTP response will consist of the record with the ID that is specified in the path over here. We have passed 1 over here, so we'll get back this record with ID 1, which is what I listed over here under HTTP response. Observe that this is one object, it is not an array, because our intention was to get only one record. Let's write this by hand also. So we want to read one record, so we have to use the get operation, because to read or retrieve records, we need to use the get HTTP request method. So I'm going to write get space, the path will be /books/1 if we want to retrieve the book record with ID 1, and then we have to specify the HTTP version. So I'll write HTTP/1.1. So we have written our request line now. Next we have to specify our header fields. For HTTP 1.1, host is a required header field. So let's write that, and it will be localhost colon 4000, and it's always better to specify content type. So let's write content type application/JSON. And when this HTTP request reaches the API, this path, since it has books and /1, it will match this books resource, and this record which has ID 1 will be sent back as the HTTP response. So I'm going to copy this record and paste it over here. And so this will be a HTTP response to this particular HTTP request over here. Next, let us create a book record. And to create a book record, we need to use the post HTTP request method. So our HTTP request will be post/books followed by HTTP/1.1 followed by the header fields that we have seen previously. And below the header fields, we'll have an empty line. And below the empty line, we'll have a message body, which consists of some JSON. Let's examine this one more time. When we use post, we usually pass a message in the message body, and in our case we are using JSON, so our message body will consist of some JSON data. When this HTTP request reaches the API, this message also reaches the API since it's part of the HTTP request, and what will happen is a new book record will be created and added to the books array. As you can see, we have a new book entry over here, and the author is new author, which is what we specified in the message body. So once this record gets created, it will mean that the processing is done on the API side, and it will send back a HTTP response with the new record. So the HTTP response will consist of this newly created record over here, which is what I have listed over here. Let us write this HTTP request also by hand. So we are going to create a new book record, and to create a new record we need to use the post HTTP request method. So let's write post followed by the path /books followed by the HTTP version HTTP/1.1, and that is a request line. And as usual we have to specify our headers. Post is a required header, so let's write that localhost :4000, and it's always better to specify content type, so let's write that, and let's specify application/json. And in this HTTP request we want to create a new book record, and so we need to send information about that new book record to the server, and so we need to specify that in the message body. So let's add a blank line below a header fields at line number 6 over here, and starting from line number 7 let us specify some JSON that will contain details of the new book record. And so I'm going to write author. Observe that I have specified the double quotes since JSON keys need double quotes, and the value will be new author. Once the HTTP request reaches the API, what will happen is a new book record will be created with the ID 3 and with the author value new author, which is basically from the JSON data that we specified in the message body of this HTTP request. And once this new record is created, this will be sent back as the HTTP response. So I'm going to copy this record and I'll paste that here as the HTTP response. So the newly created record will be returned as the response. Next, let us look at an example to update a record. And to update a record, we can use either the put or patch methods. Let us use the patch method over here. And so our HTTP request will look like this. The request line will have patch followed by the path to the book that we want to update. In this case, we want to update the book with the ID 3, which is this record over here. And then we have the HTTP version and the host header field and the content-type header field. And below the header fields, we have an empty line. And below the empty line, we have a message body with a new value of O Henry for the author field. So our intention is to change this value of new author to the value O Henry that we specified over here. So when this request reaches the API, since the message is a part of the request, that also reaches the API, and processing will happen, and the value of author in this record will be updated to O Henry, which is what we specified in the JSON data over here. Let's examine this one more time. This record over here has new author as the value for author field, and we want to update this value new author to O Henry using this JSON data over here. So we have specified that JSON data in the message body of the HTTP request, and when this HTTP request is processed by the API, the value of the record is updated to O Henry. And once that updating is done, we get back a HTTP response, as we can see here. We can see that the book record with ID 3 now has the author value as O Henry. Let's write this request also by hand. So we want to update a record, and to update a record we need to use the patch HTTP request method, and our intention is to update this particular record, and within this record we want to update the author field from new author to O Henry. So let's begin our request line by writing patch, and then the path will be /books/3, which is the ID of the book that we want to update, followed by HTTP/1.1. So that is a request line. Next we have to write our header fields. The host field is required in HTTP 1.1, so let's write that, and let's write localhost :4000, assuming that our API is running on localhost :4000, and it's always better to specify content type, so let's write application/json as the content type. And since we want to update this record's author value, we need to send the new value, and let us specify a message body for that. So I have specified an empty line in line number 6 over here, and starting in line number 7 let us specify some JSON data. So let's specify the field name that we want to update, which is author, and let's specify our new value, which is O Henry. So now we have specified some JSON data in the message body of this HTTP request. When this HTTP request reaches the API, the path over here /books/3 and the patch method indicate to the API that we want to update the books resource with ID 3, and the update that we want to do is within the message body as JSON data. So the author field will be updated to this new value O Henry. So this value will be updated from new author to O Henry. And once this update is done, the updated record is sent back as the HTTP response. So I'm going to copy this record that got updated and I'm going to paste this here, and this is going to be our HTTP response. And the final example we'll look into is a delete operation. To delete a record, we need to use the delete HTTP method. Let's say we want to delete this record with ID 3. Then our HTTP request will look like this. The request line will start with delete, and then the path will be /books/3, where 3 is the ID of the book record that we want to delete. And then we'll have the HTTP version, and then we'll have the host and content type header fields. When this request reaches the API will understand that it has to delete a book record with the ID 3, and so it will proceed to delete the record with ID 3. And as you can see here, the book record with ID 3 got deleted. And once that is done, we get back a HTTP response, and the HTTP response will be an empty object. Let's examine this one more time. To delete a book record, we'll have to specify the delete HTTP method in the request line, and then in the path we have to specify the ID of the book record that we want to delete, and then we have to specify the header fields. We don't need to specify any message body, and the HTTP response will be an empty object. Let's write this request also by hand. So we want to delete a record, and in order to delete a record, we need to use the delete HTTP method. In this example, we want to delete this record with ID 3. So in our request line, we have to write delete, and then we have to specify the path as books/3, where 3 is the ID of the book that we want to delete. And then we have to specify HTTP/1.1, and then we have to specify the host header field, which is localhost 4000. And let us also specify the content type, which will be application/JSON. And when this request reaches the API looks at the request line, and it understands that it has to delete a record, and the path of the record that needs to be deleted is over here. So it understands that it has to delete a book record with ID 3, which is this record over here, and so it proceeds to delete it. So I'm going to remove this record here, and now this record is removed. Let me remove the trailing comma also over here, and now the record with ID 3 has been deleted. That means processing of the HTTP request has finished, and so it will send back a HTTP response now, and the HTTP response will be an empty object.